not being here today. It seems to be the week that people decided to take leave. Yes, actually, you're probably actually quite right. Probably is the most natural explanation. Everyone's saying spend time with their beloved children. Or they'd think after spending yesterday with your beloved children, that you'd actually want to have a night off and come to a nice, lovely lecture about critical thinking. But enough said about that, the better. Okay, so today we're going to continue looking at where we fell off looking last time. So in the last lecture we ended with talk of inference is the best explanation. Now we're going to actually look at what an inference is the best explanation is, and then we're going to talk very briefly about what role conspiracy theories play here, at which point I can put on my absolute expert's hat, given that I am, if not one of the internationally recognized experts in the discussion of conspiracy theories, belief in, and arguments for. So I get to be I'm actually an expert here. I'm talking in my particular field for about 5 minutes, and we go back to just general critical thinking talk. And so the point of today's lecture is basically looking at how we generate explanations, how we justify those explanations, and also what do we do when we have to think about when there might be more than one explanation on a table. How do we evaluate those particular claims? And then we're going to change tack entirely and look at arguments by analogy. And arguments by analogy end up being kind of perverse to look at, because there are lots of ways to argue by analogy, and most of them are pretty terrible. And yet, by and large, most of us like to make analogies when we provide arguments in support of particular views, and many of us don't like it when people question the analogies we put forward. So there's a kind of double standard that occurs in argumentation. We like to criticize other people's analogies. We really don't like our analogies being criticized by other people. You accuse them, no, you're being far too literal about it, even though 5 minutes earlier you were being very literal about someone else's analogy and pointing out why that didn't work. So there's a whole bunch of related issues going on there. But let's start from the beginning. So at the end of the last lecture, we looked at inferences to the best explanation. When we are inferring to an explanation, we basically have to weigh up a variety of different things. First of all, you have to go, well, look, an event has occurred within the world. Have I considered all of the available alternatives that would explain how that event came to pass? So think about Rudyard Kipling's Just So stories. The Just So stories are lovely examples of how, say, animals like the leopard got its spots. So you have people finger painting with magic paint over the side of the cat to give it unique markings. Now that would be a lovely explanation if it were true. Is it true? Did leopards get their spots by people finger painting markings upon them? If not, what kind of rival explanations are there for how leopards got their spots? Anyone know why we have Anyone know why we have spotted animals? All right, so one hypothesis is all about camouflage, a good way for them to hide in dappled trees, because big cats often like hiding in trees and then pouncing on nearby humans or other things they want to predate upon. Any other rationales you might know for why we have spotted animals? Because it turns out, and this is very recent, also turns out that spotted animals are less likely to be attacked by ticks or mosquitoes. Because it actually confuses the flight patterns of those particular insects when they're trying to land. They actually get confused by the different, what they appear to be packets of light upon the skin. So not only is it useful for camouflage with respect to the leopard, it's also useful for making them more resistant, essentially, to particular types of insect predators who would predate upon them. And this all came out from studies as to why zebras have stripes, which sounds like a great Rudyard Kipling story, why the zebra has its stripes. Because zebras don't live in an environment where being black and white is in any way advantageous to them in a camouflage way. So the camouflage hypothesis never worked for the zebra. And it turns out actually striped animals in that environment are much less likely to be attacked by ticks than any other animal. So that's presumably why zebras develop stripes. And so it turns out sometimes you'll have lots of competing or complementary explanations which are going to be acting in tandem. And actually most of the research we have in evolutionary biology is about different strategies being co-opted for the same ends. So you can have a camouflage strategy which also has some other benefits as well. Because by and large, leopards are trying to hide from humans. They're not really trying to hide from mosquitoes. It just turns out that by being able to hide from a human in a tree, you're also less likely to be attacked by clouds of mosquitoes, which also might be hanging around trees as well. So we need to know, do we have all of the available hypotheses on hand to be able to judge which one's most likely versus which one's least likely? And also we've got to be aware that sometimes we jump to conclusions, because we've all got individual preconceived notions or biases or other bits and pieces, which sometimes mean that we're more likely to take a particular view seriously than we would do if we actually thought about it closely, or we're more likely to deride a view which actually on second glance might be worth our while. So for example, going back to the election just passed, a lot of people's gut reactions to Dirty Politics were not informed by them reading the book Dirty Politics. Many people had reactions to Dirty Politics because they were either left voters or right voters. So some people on the right went, well look, obviously Dirty Politics is a hatchet job of some respects because, you know, it's a claim against the party I support and I just can't believe they'll do that. Well, so also we might call this the... Oh, I had a great name for this before and it's completely gone out of my head. The Mike Hoskins defense. John Key's a lovely fella, therefore Dirty Politics must be false. Or you might have people on the left who have done exactly the same thing by going, well look, Nikki Hack is a respected journalist. I don't need to read the book to know that this proves that National's been up to no good. We might call this the Martin Bradbury defense, where they're going, well look, I'm of the firm belief that actually this describes terrible behaviour. Don't need to read the book to have that confirmed. That's informing my vote. Those are assumptions operating there. You're not evaluating the argument on its own merits. Who actually did end up reading Dirty Politics out of curiosity? All right, just one person. What was your overall opinion of Dirty Politics?
Well, I sort of vote to the right. And I actually thought the book was quite well read because, you know, it's 120 pages of narrative and 40 pages of cross references. So he'd done well to justify all the stuff he quoted. And, you know, and I had the view that it's definitely a case to answer with Collins and what have you, but it's what he didn't put in. So I just wondered from a critical thinking point of view, it'd be easy to extract all those emails and create that story, but there might have been other stuff.
Yes, actually, yeah.
So there was a case to answer. I didn't think you needed to hang anybody over it. You know, put Cameron Slater in a horrible situation with his other people and Judith Collins. So I thought it was well researched and objectively written, but it was the omission, I suppose. Looking at it critically, I thought, well,
what's not there?
What's not there?
Yeah, actually, so this is something. And this is, I'll mention it now in brief, but if you want a really good dissection of it, buy my book. There's this issue we call selective evidence. And I say we call it, I've named it selective evidence. I'm hoping the name will catch on. Where every time you want to create a narrative, and historians do this all the time, you select the evidence you're going to present, and you will often leave some evidence to one side. This is particularly prominent in 20th century history, where we have such a depth of documentary evidence that we could present, and yet you don't want to present all of it because it would bore people to death. Okay, so on the 16th of June, and the following events occurred, and you list all the births, deaths all around the world, that which you want to go, no, you don't need to present all that information. Just say what the salient event of that particular day was for your narrative. But because we're always selecting evidence to support a particular view, there is a very big question here, what are you leaving out? Now, of course, Nicky Hager's response to that was he was leaving out personal information which had absolutely no bearing upon the case. So, as we saw with the data dumps that came out from the hacker Rorschach, some of the information that Nicky Hager didn't publish was information about Cameron Slater's father's heart condition. Because Nicky Hager said, that's just not relevant to the discussion. That's personal information of no particular merit to my particular discussion. But of course, it is actually a fairly interesting concern here. Anyone who presents a case which is based upon leaked information, what aren't they revealing to you? And so that shows that you had a informed commentary upon the book and looked at it and then put it through a critical lens, unlike the people that I'm referring to who, in some cases, will have made their decision on the contents of the book without actually ever reading the book. Their preconceived notions confirm the hypothesis, no matter what the evidence actually is. And certainly I know people on the left who didn't read the book and were making very big conspiracy theory claims about what was in it. Because, no, if you actually read the book, there's some terrible things you're not talking about, but that stuff there, that's just completely made up. And maybe you should actually take a step back, read the book, and then make your claims of conspiracy. And that gets us quite nicely to claims of conspiracy. So when I first developed this course with my colleague back in the Department of Philosophy, we had a particular view about conspiracy theories that they would fit what we call the just so fallacy analysis. Often people put forward conspiracy theories because they're convenient explanations of an event, which happen to fit the facts, but by and large the claim of conspiracy is unlikely or improbable, and therefore people are jumping to a claim of conspiracy rather than considering more prosaic alternatives. And in many respects you get examples like this, whereby people get concerned about, say, the death of Princess Diana. Interestingly enough, when I gave an example like this in class earlier today, dealing with people who were probably born in the late 90s, most of them didn't really have any idea of who Princess Diana was. I'm assuming everyone here remembers where they were the day that Diana died, and were personally affected by the death of the people's princess, because it was a horrific time for us all. Actually, does anyone remember where they were when they heard Diana was dead? Yeah? Yeah? Where were you, out of curiosity?
I was washing the dishes at home.
Oh, did you sort of stop, break a dish, or really?
Break a dish
Oh.
and stop.
Just stopped?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure where I was, but the thing that amazed me with that was the fact that you could just turn on the television and watch it virtually live on CNN, a bit like 9/11. You were sort of a bystander really, because
Yes, very voyeurs.
the coverage now, you can actually be there and watch it all.
And actually, what was interesting to my mind was actually how into it the Americans got with the death of Princess Diana. There's actually a quite interesting dialogue to be had about the American fascination with the British royal family, especially given the fact that one of the founding notions of the American state was cutting all ties to the British royal family and all it represented. But as you'll know, there are lots of conspiracy theories about the death of Princess Diana, by and large run by Dodi's father, a rich Egyptian business person who works in London, who runs Harrods. Anyone been to Harrods in the last 10 years and seen that wonderful statue of Diana and Dodi with the birds flying out of all orifices? It's really, it's actually disturbingly tacky. But what's interesting about it is that there is a continual story about whether Princess Diana was killed at the behest of the British state or whether it was a tragic car accident. And it's because there are two rival hypotheses here. You have a tragic accident, which is based upon a whole bunch of things having to be true at the same time. You had a chauffeur who was drunk, travelling at high speed, trying to get away from a paparazzi motorcade, with two passengers in the back of the car who didn't happen to be wearing seatbelts at the time, which is the recipe for a disaster, but it does have a whole bunch of, well, how likely would it be that someone would travel in their limousine without wearing a seatbelt? Actually, it turns out fairly high. People who drive around in limousines do think they're pretty much immune to any kind of car accident. How likely would it be the chauffeur was drunk? Well, actually it turns out he was a recovering alcoholic with personal issues at the time, so a relapse was actually relatively likely. And travelling at high speed when being chased by paparazzi is the kind of thing that might make a drunk driver take risky manoeuvres inside a tunnel. versus the claim that maybe the British royal family had decided that they were scared that Princess Diana was about to father a child to the son of a prominent Muslim business person, which would then mean that the future Crown Prince of the UK would have a Muslim brother-in-law who would be, Muslim's a half-brother, who would naturally be in line for the throne of England, and therefore we could have a Muslim king should one of the other ones die. The problem with this particular argument is actually any child of Diana not born of Charles was going to have absolutely no connection to the royal line unless it went through the Spencer line, which is very, very, very distant from being king or queen, depending on the sex of the child. So these are conspiracy theories which have been put forward here. And what's interesting about this, of course, is that many people are very suspicious of conspiracy theories. Virtually no one likes to be called a conspiracy theorist, to the point that if you want to put forward a conspiracy theory in normal conversation, almost everyone goes, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but, and you can guarantee what they'll say after the but will be a classically formed conspiracy theory. In the same respect, if someone says, I'm not racist, but, you can pretty much guarantee that next thing they're going to say is racist. I'm not sexist, next thing they'll say is going to be sexist. We use it as a marker for saying, look, I'm going to put forward an example of X, but don't refer to me as the kind of person who typically puts forward examples of X. Because for some reason, we think that conspiracy theories are unlikely to be true. Now the question is this suspicion justified? So let's be a little precise about talk of conspiracy theories here. I'm going to put forward a definition. This definition is somewhat controversial. I'll ask you as to why that might be in just a sec. I say conspiracy theory is simply an explanation that cites the existence of a conspiracy as a salient cause of an event. And I'm claiming that is a controversial definition of a conspiracy theory. Can anyone present to me an inkling as to why they think that might be a controversial definition? Because it's not the standard definition. And yet I think it's actually the most obvious definition, which is why the fact that it's controversial is slightly confounding. Anyone have any idea?
Well, don't you have to establish that the cause of the event is as a result of a conspiracy between various parties?
Well, right, so but the definition does bake that in. It's saying, look, a conspiracy theory is an explanation that cites the existence of a conspiracy. So you have to say there exists a conspiracy. And then that conspiracy is the cause of some event. So as long as we know an event occurred, and we can establish that there exists some conspiracy, the conspiracy theory says they are linked together. See, maybe you're as confounded or perplexed by this question as I normally am. Most people, and by most people I'm going to say most academics, will define a conspiracy theory as being prima facie irrational. So it's a theory which is not likely to be true and is typically believed by people who are suffering from some kind of paranoid ideation or suffering from some psychological complex, or are the kind of people who, through no fault of their own, i.e. a lack of critical thinking or critical thinking training, see conspiracies where they aren't, or just overemphasize the chance of a conspiracy being the most likely explanation of an event. So most academics will say a conspiracy theory is by default something you should not believe. Now I think that's a problematic move in the literature, because it essentially says, look, anything which resembles a conspiracy theory, which happens to be true, turns out not to be a conspiracy theory, because we know by definition conspiracy theories are false. And that's problematic for the sheer fact that there are lots of lovely examples throughout 20th century history, and going even further back but with less detail, of cases where people actually did conspire, and conspired successfully, and tarred their opponents as being mere conspiracy theorists for dare suggesting that a conspiracy was actually responsible for the event that's being explained. Let me provide you with more in the way of detail about that. Oh, actually, no, first of all, this is one of my favourite local conspiracy theories. This came out 7 years ago. So Trevor Loudon, who's a former president of the ACT Party, now writes a blog called New Zeal, located down in Christchurch. And Bernard Moran, who is an Australian geopolitical specialist, wrote a paper claiming that the Labour government in 1984 had been infiltrated by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union to make New Zealand less friendly towards America, to bring about communist rule in the Pacific. And I find this to be an astounding claim, given what the 1984 Labour government actually did by bringing in neoliberal reforms. Because if it was the case that that was an elaborate KGB orchestrated plot by the communists in Russia, what it successfully did was made us closer to America and further away from the socialist utopia the Russians actually wanted us to be. And their entire plot is based upon the testimony of a man who had been dead for 10 years by the time that they wrote the article, whose name they said they couldn't print. So they could tell us a very elaborate story about a Labour Party operative who had been sent to Vladivostok and been trained by the KGB to come back and infiltrate the Labour Party, which was apparently being run by lesbians at the time, according to this particular informant, to make it more friendly towards communist Russia. And in the entire article, there is no justification other than the testimony of a dead man whose name they can't even print. And yet it got lauded by the NBR at the time as proof positive of the disastrous nature of the New Zealand Labour Party. And there are many reasons to be suspicious about the New Zealand Labour Party and also communist sympathies within New Zealand. New Zealand was the last Western nation to drop support for Stalin, for example. So up until 1956, the New Zealand Communist Party was of the firm opinion that Stalin wasn't really all that bad, and actually all the stuff that had come out about Stalin was disinformation being spread by Stalinist detractors. And then when Nikita Khrushchev came into power and then admitted actually everything everyone was saying about Stalin was true, the New Zealand Communist Party almost promptly disbanded in absolute despair. But when it comes to the claim that the 1984 Labour government was actually being run by the communists in the Kremlin, that just doesn't seem particularly likely. There are also lots of other particularly nice examples of this particular material, which we might have a talk about in a break. So, as I said, some people think that conspiracy theories are a result of the inference to any old explanation, rather than inference to the best explanation. So, getting back to that point you made before, if we want to, which was about linking a claim of conspiracy with an actual conspiracy theory, if you actually want to talk about conspiracy theories and evaluate conspiracy theories, I think what you've got to do is you have to treat each individual conspiracy theory on its own merits. So we can all point towards people who are conspiracy theorists who believe any old conspiracy theory, but there's a name for these kinds of people in the literature. They are called conspiracists. A conspiracist is someone who will believe any conspiracy theory they hear. And the definition of conspiracism has it that they either believe it because they suffer from paranoid ideation, or something very similar to it, or they have faulty assumptions about the likelihood of conspiracies operating within the world, or they're just gullible fools. But conspiracism shouldn't be confused with belief in actual individual conspiracy theories, in the same respect that we know of atheists who have really, really, really bad arguments for their atheism. In the same respect, we also know of theists who have really, really bad arguments for their theism. But we shouldn't tar the entire pool of atheists or theists based upon a few people who have bad reasons for being a member of that community. We should actually analyse the arguments in support of either atheism or theism. In the same respect, we shouldn't tar the pool of people who believe in conspiracy theories merely based upon the fact that there are some irrational people out there in the world. We know there are irrational people out there in the world. We know that there are examples of political journalists who have agendas and chase stories not because they are interested in investigating the truth, but rather because they've got a personal vendetta. And yet we shouldn't tar the entire class of journalists based upon a few Patrick Gowers or people of that particular ilk. In the same respect, just because we know of conspiracy theorists who act irrationally, that doesn't tell us that every conspiracy theorist is someone who acts irrationally. What we should be doing is evaluating conspiracy theories on their own merits. So if we want to say a conspiracy theory is good, or we want to show a conspiracy theory is bad, then we need to look at two separate claims. The first is, can you show there existed a conspiracy? Now, a conspiracy is simply more than two people, well, two or more people is a better way to define it, operating in secret, trying to achieve some end. So you can't conspire on your own, although you can certainly give it a good go. And you have to have an end point in mind, and you've got to do it secretly. In fact, a nice example of this is organising a surprise party, which when you think about it is actually a fairly conspiratorial thing to do. Let's imagine we want to organise a surprise party for me, and you're going, right, so Matthew needs a surprise party. His birthday is actually on July the 8th of next year, so we've got lots of time to prepare. So let's not tell Matthew we're going to organise a surprise party. If we tell him we're organising a surprise party, then that's not really going to be much of a surprise. And let's get together next week and organise a spectacular surprise party. Next week comes, you spend a bit of time considering what you're going to do, and then someone says, well, actually, no, before we get down to the nitty-gritty of this, I've got this lovely 16-year-old bottle of whiskey I just bought. Let's all just sample a dram, and then we'll get on to the exciting planning of the party. Half a bottle later, you suddenly go, well, you know, actually, I'm slightly under the weather now. Let's get round to planning this next week. And it turns out every week you get together to plan the surprise party. You never actually get round to actually doing any of the nitty-gritty, working out where it's going to be held, who you're going to invite, and what kind of Cheerios you're going to buy, the purple or the red ones. And so July the 9th comes around, and it turns out you failed to host the surprise party for me. Now, on some level, you have still been conspiring. You had an intended end, organising the surprise party. You were operating in secret because you denied the existence of this organisation to me the entire time. And you did it together. It just turns out that nothing of note actually occurred because of your conspiratorial activity. So one thing to note about talking about conspiracies is that people can conspire and do nothing whatsoever of note. So just because you're in a conspiracy doesn't in any way mean you're going to achieve anything. And the other thing, of course, is even if you can show there exists a conspiracy, and this feeds on from it, you also need to show that the conspiracy is causally responsible for some event within the world. This is a nice hypothetical which comes out of the 9/11 conspiracy theories. So there are two different conspiracy theories with respect to the event of 9/11. One conspiracy theory is what we would call the official hypothesis. An organization called Al-Qaeda, masterminded by an individual called Osama bin Laden, organized a terrorist attack upon New York City. Now, this is an example of a conspiracy because the kind of terrorist activity that was undertaken by Al-Qaeda is typical of conspiratorial activity. The hijackers worked in secret. They had a particular end in mind, which was flying the Boeing 747s into the two towers of the Twin Towers, the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and an attempted attack upon the White House in Washington, D.C. They did it in secret. The kind of terrorist activity they were doing was conspiratorial. It just happens to be it's a conspiracy theory which is widely accepted within both the political and academic realm because it happens to be based upon really good evidence. The other conspiracy theory, the one that often gets talked about, is what's called the inside job hypothesis. This is the claim that actually the story I've just told you is a tissue of lies. Actually, 9/11 was orchestrated by elements within the American government, and these elements within the American government blamed Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden as a kind of false flag campaign. But actually what they did was either they flew the planes into the towers under orders from people within the avionics industry, or they blew the towers up with a controlled demolition, or they used sonic weaponry, or the towers were holograms the entire time. The details of this particular hypothesis become slightly vague because there are lots of different versions of it. And the people who support the inside job hypothesis like to point out that there are numerous documents authored by members of the Republican Party which basically say things like this. It would be really great if there was a terrorist attack on mainland America, because if there was a terrorist attack upon mainland America, that would justify particular military exercises overseas, such as establishing new military outposts and securing oil reserves to ensure that America has all the supplies it needs for the 20th century and the 21st century. And so this gets put forward as saying, look, Dick Cheney and co. were obviously engaged in a thought experiment or an actual activity wanting a terrorist attack upon America to justify further action. And they will use this as evidence of a conspiracy by members of the cabinet of the Bush regime and say, look, they wanted it, it happened, surely we can connect the dots and go, well, if they wanted it that badly, maybe they made it happen. Now, even if we admit that there was a cartel within the American establishment that was going, it would be really great if there was a terrorist activity going on at this moment in time to justify what we want to do. And maybe they even said to the CIA, look, just underplay any intelligence that comes in about terrorist activity on mainland America. I mean, I'm sure it doesn't really mean anything, but, just play it down ever so slightly. That would be a story where there might be a small-scale conspiracy by members of the Republican Party to encourage activities within America, which would then justify military action overseas. But it would still be the case that Al-Qaeda organized the attack, masterminded the attack, and carried out the attack. So you could have a conspiracy by the Republicans, and it would still be true that the real explanation of the event was a terrorist activity by Al-Qaeda. So just because people are conspiring, and I'm definitely not saying that Dick Cheney was responsible for a conspiracy to foster attacks within America, but even if you believe that is true, you still have to account for the fact that there is a rival explanatory hypothesis that also cites a conspiracy that says actually maybe the real cause of the event was overseas terrorism being led by Al-Qaeda. So that's why we need to be aware that just because you can show that a conspiracy is occurring, that doesn't necessarily mean it's achieving much of note. For a slightly less contentious and more topical local example, one of the things that came out of Dirty Politics was the fact that Simon Lusk, Judith Collins, and Cam Slater were trying to game the National Party candidate selection process to ensure that people sympathetic to Judith Collins were being selected as electorate MPs, so that when the time came, Judith Collins would have the numbers basically to be able to make herself leader of the National Party. And so large chunks of Dirty Politics is communications between Simon Lusk, Jason Eade, and Cam Slater talking about how they want this candidate to be the MP for this particular electorate. And you can arguably say they were involved in a conspiracy at that point to get their candidates out in front, engaging in dirty politics against national contenders by smear campaigns against rival candidates and the like. And yet they often weren't particularly successful, because even though they could disseminate information, or in some cases disinformation, they were still relying on people voting within that particular community. So they conspired, but in many cases the conspiracy doesn't explain the candidate selection process, because actually more prosaic democratic means are a better explanation there. And maybe in the break, if people want to talk about their favoured conspiracy theories and such like, we can do that. But let us, for the time being, move on to something much less contentious. And actually this goes back to the other talk about suppressed evidence and selective evidence we were talking about with dirty politics. Everything's coming together quite nicely. Certain arguments rely upon information not being made explicit in the argument for the argument to work. So going back to my favourite examples about North Head, some of the people who talk about the North Head Tunnel Complex conspiracy theory talk about the fact that there are lots and lots of witnesses who claim to have been inside the tunnel complex that no one is allegedly able to get into now. This is a very simplified one, which hopefully actually makes the exactly what's wrong with this argument quite clear. But you might go, look, I'm beginning to think that the stories of a hidden tunnel complex deep within North Head might well be true. I've spoken with 3 people who worked on North Head when it was under the control of the Navy, and they swear that they've been in tunnels they can no longer find access to on the hills. Oh, sorry, I'm reading an example you can't see. What do you think might be wrong with that particular argument? What else would you need to know to evaluate and work out whether that argument was any good? Alright, so one question is, how old were the people? So, do you want to explain why you want to know about the age?
Well, they could be little kids.
Oh, so the people who have been on the hill could be little kids, and that would be a problem because, just to make your reasoning more explicit?
Their recall may not be as accurate.
All right, so we might be worried here about their status as eyewitnesses. If it turns out that we've spoken with 3 people who were last on North Head 50 years ago, and they claim they've been in tunnels they can no longer get access to, you might go, 50 years is a very, very long time. Are you absolutely sure that this gun battery we're in right now isn't the gun battery you were in 50 years ago? Because you were smaller then, and it looked different. Could it be the same place? Is that the kind of thing you're thinking about there? Yeah? So that's certainly one thing we would certainly ask. What passage of time has occurred? What else might we ask about this particular argument?
The fact that they can't find access doesn't mean it doesn't exist. They're not looking in the wrong places.
All right, so the fact that, and actually, funnily enough, I lost an entire set of tunnels on North Head for about 5 years. And given that I found it again, I don't think it had actually disappeared. I think so. North Head is looked after by the Department of Conservation, and the Department of Conservation is very, very badly funded, which means there are periods of time where they don't really prune any of the trees or bushes on North Head. Turns out that some of the bushes just grew over the pathway down to a particular tunnel complex I was fond of visiting, because wandering around a circular set of tunnels trying to find entrances is always slightly confusing at the best of times. I just didn't find the pathway for 5 years. I didn't think they had gone missing. I just knew that I couldn't work out where they were anymore. And then one day they pruned the trees, and lo and behold, the steps down to the tunnel complex was there. So the fact that I couldn't find it tells us nothing about whether they've gone missing. It just tells you something about someone's locational skills. Anything else we can say about it? Yeah.
Ask another question, because I'm not an Aucklander.
Yeah.
It's irrelevant to me. Why is it important?
Well, that's a very good question, because the citizens of Devonport are very wealthy, and we look after the interests of our wealthy citizens here. And that is actually part of it. The North Head Tunnel conspiracy theory has a major set of theories about there being explosives deep within the hill, which, if they were to go off, would drastically affect the property prices in Cheltenham. Cheltenham, until recently, was the most expensive suburb in the country. It's now where I live, over in Herne Bay. I think I've made this joke before. The government should move me around, because I obviously bring house prices up wherever I live. So it was important on a financial level, also on an insurance level. Any dig had to be indemnified for any damage it might do. And also just for the sheer fact that it's a conspiracy theory about major government malfeasance. If there are hidden tunnels, the government has lied to the people of New Zealand about their existence. And that's the kind of thing we probably should be concerned with. Anything else?
Matthew, 3 people.
All right, thank you.
I was
We've got
thinking
to
the
do
same
that.
thing.
Yeah, all right. So 3 people. So North Head was started to be built in 1890. It was an operational fort until 1946, at which point it became a naval training ground up until 1996. So it has almost 100 years of military occupation. If it turns out I can find you 3 people over that period of time who claim to have been in tunnels that are no longer there, isn't that a bit suspicious? Yeah, you'd expect if there was a massive hidden tunnel complex there, you'd have a large number of ratings and soldiers who would have gone, yeah, well, when I was there used to be additional tunnels. Turns out when you interview most of the people who worked on North Head, most of them will say, look, it's exactly the way we left it, minus a few light fittings and such like. It's only a small number of individuals who claim the tunnel complex has changed in any particular way. So the big question here is 3 compared to what? 3 people compared to 5 people. You might go, well, that's pretty suggestive. Over half the people who've ever been on North Head claim it has changed. 3 people compared to hundreds of people. You might go, well, 3 people compared to hundreds of people either indicates a massive conspiracy by the Army and Navy and the government of New Zealand to suppress this information, or it indicates that 3 of the people who work there have faulty memories, and maybe we shouldn't trust their testimony in this particular respect. And this is where so much of the debate about the North Head Tunnel complex actually ended up, because the conspiracy theorists will go, well, we can show you anecdotal evidence of people who can't find tunnels they know they've been in, and then the Department of Conservation investigation will go, yeah, but we can show you thousands of people who used to work on the head who say it's exactly the same as it ever was. So why should we trust your small group of witnesses who claim to have been in tunnel complexes that are actually physically impossible to build in some situations, versus our larger number of people who claim nothing has changed? And that's suppressed evidence here. The argument only works if you don't ask 3 compared to what. And that's an issue we have with so many arguments in the wild. People sometimes leave out crucial information, because by leaving that crucial information out, it makes their argument seem all the stronger. And we need to be aware of that when we're analysing these particular claims. So here's another example, once again, on the North Head time. The Boeing seaplanes and 5 other aeronautic contraptions from the New Zealand Flying School at Kohimaramara were shipped to Torpedo Yard in Devonport when the school was shut down. 5 of the planes were burnt and 2 were put into storage in tunnels on North Head. These tunnels were subsequently lost and the planes were never extracted. Thus the 2 Boeing seaplanes are still within the hill. What's wrong with that particular argument? This is yet another example of suppressed evidence.
Where's the information coming
All right, so can you expand upon that?
from? Well, it's just saying X, Y, Z happened, but how do you know that? Like,
All right,
is
so
it from a document that said they buried it there, that's, like,
all right,
or
so
someone
let's accept for the sake of argument that the central claims are, apart from so the conclusion, this is Boeing seaplanes in the hill, that's what we're meant to be persuaded of. So we ignore that for the time being. So it is true that the New Zealand Flying School in Kohimaramara, the first flying school ever devised in New Zealand, run by the Walsh brothers, run privately up until 1914, when suddenly the New Zealand government decided to devise an air force and made every air asset in the country public rather than private property, at which point the flying school shut down. They had the very first 2 Boeing seaplanes ever built by the Boeing and Westerveld Corporation. The Boeing Corporation has said if you could get back at least one piece of a Boeing seaplane, the first ones they built, they would give you a 747 in return. So it's a very valuable bit of their avionic history. The reason why they came to New Zealand was that they were the first planes Boeing and Westerveld built, and thus they were not considered to be particularly important at the time. It just turns out the Boeing Corporation is really big now and would like elements of their history back. It is true that when the flying school was shut down, they disposed of many of the assets and shipped some of the assets over to Torpedo Yard in Devonport. And it is alleged, although it's not necessarily considered to be true, that some of those assets were bricked up into a cave on North Head, the cave of which has not been found. It sounds as if you're about to...
You're making an assumption that which planes were in the tunnel.
Yes, thank you. So the crucial move here is that when we say 5 of the planes were burnt and 2 were put into storage in tunnels on North Head, that we're assuming the 2 that were put into storage are the Boeings. Now, it turns out there's a good reason for making that assumption. The Boeings are incredibly worth a lot of money now. So the Boeings, if you found a Boeing, you get a 747 in return. You need an awfully long driveway and a very large garage to be able to house your Boeing 747. But I'm sure the corporation will give you money in part trade. They'll probably give you half a Boeing 747
That's
in
an
cash.
assumption because you don't know what the 5 other aeronautical trucks
Yeah,
are.
precisely.
They could be more
Did the
expensive.
fire know?
Yeah.
Did the fire know they were valuable?
Yeah, well, so herein lies the issue. We now know the Boeing seaplanes are valuable because if they existed today, you get a very large amount of money for them. But in the 30s, when this is all meant to have occurred, when they were working out what to keep and what to dispose of, the Boeing 747s were described in the logbook as being dilapidated, non-flight worthy, and of no value whatsoever. So at the time, the 2 Boeing seaplanes were things you could quite happily dispose of because there was no purpose in keeping them. They just would have taken up space. The Avro 540Ks, which were the other planes that the flying school had, were still relatively modern craft of their era, some of which were broken down, but enough of which could actually be taken apart to build at least 2 worthy units. And so it's much more likely the usable planes were taken to Devonport and the unusable ones were burnt. But the Avros are not significant, valuable artifacts now. The Boeings are. So it would be convenient if, going against common wisdom, they'd thrown away the planes that did work and kept the planes that didn't. And crucially, in the North Head story, this is all the information we've got. We have a logbook as to what worked and what didn't work at the Mission Bay Flying School. And we have a logbook of number of planes that arrived in Torpedo Yard with no description as to what planes they are. And thus all we've got are assumptions as to what they might have shipped over to Devonport. And because of that, this kind of argument gets put forward all the time. But actually it turns out it's not a particularly good one, because there's not enough information to infer that the valuable thing now was something that was worth their keeping then. No one in the 1970s was envisioning that 80 years later, someone might actually want to swap one of these rotting old seaplanes for a Boeing 747. If they were, they probably would have been labelled as crazy at the time because Boeing 747s didn't even exist. So that's part of the problem here. There's suppressed evidence here, which is what was shipped and what wasn't. And so people input their assumptions in these kind of situations as to what they are looking for. The conspiracy theorists who are concerned that there's a massive conspiracy to hide the seaplanes inside the North Head Tunnel complex are assuming that if 2 planes made it, it must be the 2 planes they're looking for, rather than going, actually checking the logbooks, those planes probably weren't worth keeping at the time after all. I mean, we're talking about wooden planes with cloth coverings at a point where they were beginning to work on the first steel planes. So Boeing seaplanes probably weren't particularly worth keeping at all. All right, we're going to take a short video break, and then we'll take an actual break, and people can talk about conspiracy theories to their heart's content. So, this is a little bit of At Last the 1948 Show.
Excuse me. Haven't I seen you somewhere before?
Goodness me, weren't you on the plane on the way over? Thought I recognised you.
I never forget a face.
Nor do I.
May I,
Oh, sure thing.
here on holiday, are you?
Yes, yes. And you?
Oh, yes.
Oh.
Well, there's a turn up.
I was wondering, do you have the right time?
I'm afraid I don't. I was about to ask you the same thing.
Oh,
Por favor, senor.
senor.
Senor, por favor, gracias.
Beg pardon, were you gentlemen addressing me? Oh, goodness me, weren't you two on the plane on the way over? That's right, fancy you remembering that. Never forget a face, well, there's a turn up. Well. Oh, do you mind if I join you?
No. Take a pew, always room for a little.
Oh, weren't you gentlemen on the plane on the way over?
That's right. Thought I recognised you.
Here on holiday, are you?
Oh, yes. And you?
Oh, yes. Well, where's a coincidence? Pardon me, gracias. Would you gentlemen care to join me?
Won't say no. Sometime. And which part of the world do you hail from then?
Oh, I'm from Bristol.
Yes, I thought you were. I can always place a man by his accent. I'm from Wimbledon. Yes, what about you? Where are you from then?
I'm from Edinburgh.
Edinburgh, yes. Funny, you don't sound like a Scotty.
No, well, I spent most of my life in Cardiff.
That explains it. Yes, that would explain it. Say aye.
Aye.
Whereas we Londoners would pronounce it quite differently. We'd say aye.
Aye.
Yeah. How would you say it in
Manchester.
Manchester?
We'd say aye.
Well, there you are then.
Well, that's very interesting.
Who said that? It wasn't me.
No? Oh, it must have been me then. Thought I recognised the voice.
Well, we haven't introduced each other formally. My name's Sidney Lotterby.
Oh, there's a turn up. My name's Sidney Lotterby.
So's mine. And mine? Well, isn't that a coincidence, all being called Sidney Lotterby? Who said that?
It must have been me again.
No, it was me. No, it was me. I felt my lips move. Well, what's your line of business, Mr. Lotterby?
Wholesale greengrocery.
Really? All three of you? Well, isn't that a coincidence? I'm a barrister.
I mean, you don't sound like a barrister.
Well, I used to be a wholesale greengrocer.
You don't sound like a wholesale greengrocer. I'd have put you down as a barrister. Oh, fancy that. 3 wholesale greengrocers and a barrister, all called Sidney Lotterby. Well, it takes all sorts to make a world.
That's what I always say. I always say that.
So do I. Me too, yes.
It takes all sorts to make a world. Well, forgive me saying this, but I was admiring your shirt.
Oh, thank you very much. I was, in fact, casting a few envious glances at your apparel. So was I. Yes, me too. It's not everybody's taste, but I like something a little bit different.
It'd be a sad old world if we all like the same thing.
Well, Mr. Lotterby,
call me Sidney.
Well, Sidney, I must be toddling.
Time and tide wait for no man.
Just waiting for the little lady to come down.
Yes, so am I.
Come, Sidney, we'll be late.
Come in, dear.
Well,
There's a coincidence.
So, can anyone... Actually, that gives the game away. Can anyone explain to me why I might have used that particular example to bring us into our discussion of analogies? So this is an example of 4 people who all share almost exactly the same characteristics. 3 of them turn out to be wholesale greengrocers. One of them's a barrister, used to be a wholesale greengrocer. They all speak with the same voice, they all wear the same hat, they all wear the same clothes, and as a punchline, they all turn out to have the same wife. So as analogies go, given that they all share exactly all those features, it turns out that by extension they share one further feature, the same wife, which is the kind of punchline that works really well in a sketch show and makes absolutely no sense when you actually think about it. That's the whole point of good comedy. You get the laugh and you don't think too much about it afterwards, because otherwise you go, but they're all on the same plane, but it becomes very confusing at that point. So we're going to look at analogies next, but let's take a short break now where people can take the air if they so desire, or if they've got burning questions about conspiracy theories and such like, please do ask them. Or if you just want to share your favourite conspiracy theory, please let rip. We did something. Let's see. All right. Right, so we have our initial analogy. The atom is like that of a pudding bowl. And then we moved on to the analogy that says, look, actually the atom is more like a planetary system. And actually the reason why my hand doesn't go through this table, which actually this table turns out to be mostly empty space, it just happens that there are atoms there which produce electromagnetic fields. Electromagnetic fields mean that this solid object and this solid object interact in this particular way. And thus my hand can't go through it. And the planetary model of the solar system actually held sway for quite some time until we have a new model of atomic structures. Anyone know what the new model of the atomic structure is? So can you give an analogy for the Stanley model?
Which is the makeup of protons. Can I give an analogy of one?
Yeah. So can you compare it to something that we can all grasp?
Sure. I suppose it's the makeup of these individual parts of the atom. So
Protons, neutrons, electrons.
how is that made up? So that's made up of the Stanley model. That's the best way to put it.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, the pudding bowl model and the planetary model, they were easy to compare to things that people had knowledge of. So everyone knew about the Christmas pud and how dense they were, and there was a nice analogy for the denseness of matter like this. Solar systems, you could demonstrate those in class. The new model, you have electrons which exist in a probability function that blip in and out of existence in their particular valencies, and then you have your protons and neutrons which continue to exist as a sun-like thing in the middle. But the electrons basically are here, and they're there, and they're here, and they're here, and they're there. And there basically isn't any decent analogy with an everyday object that we can apply here. Making an analogy for the standard model is actually really quite difficult. And that's because it's a quantum model, and quantum models are very, very hard to describe in the kind of terms that we're used to, because we don't live in a quantum world. We live in a macroscopic world that kind of operates above where quantum level phenomena occur. So you can make a nice analogies for atomic models of the early 20th century and middle 20th century. And to a large extent, we still use the orbital model when we teach physics in school, for the sheer fact that we know that if we lie to children at that stage, we can inform them later. We're trying to explain the probabilistic model to a 5-year-old, that's just going to blow their mind. Although actually I suspect that's probably not true. I suspect 5-year-olds are probably much more likely to believe in electrons that go in and out of existence and accept that as fact for the rest of time than a 14-year-old who'll go, what? That makes no sense whatsoever. Now the whole point about this is that the planetary model and the pudding bowl model were simply illustrative. No one was saying that literally an atom is like a pudding, that you can eat it, and it's delicious, although sometimes grandma puts too much brandy in it and the atom gets you drunk. That would be a ridiculous claim to make. It was an illustration. They're like, we're not saying they're the same as. But some people use analogies to actually present arguments for a particular claim. So they want to use their analogies saying, look, if you believe this particular kind of thing, then by analogy, you should believe this particular kind of thing as well. They're not saying it's like this, and it's a nice illustration. They're saying, look, if you believe this, then by analogy, you should believe this other thing. So we can distinguish between the illustrative ones. So the Chinese economy is like an oil tanker. It takes a lot to get going, but also takes a lot to slow it down. And turn it around, yeah.
Sounds like IBM.
Yeah, and IBM is also like an oil tanker. And so this is a great example. No one's saying the Chinese economy is literally like an oil tanker with someone who tends to it, someone who has to put the fuel in, someone who actually drives the ship. Hey, look, it's just like it. The analogy here is that it takes a long time to get the economy going, but once it's going to keep going. It takes a lot to stop it. It's not literally an oil tanker, but they share the same kind of characteristics as a nice illustration. In the same respect, when people write poetry and go, look, his lips are like petals, his eyes more beautiful than the beautiful blue amethyst of Galveston. Not going, look, his lips are literally like petals. You can rip them off, rub them against your skin, and then discard them. That would be revolting. In the same respect, you're not saying the eyes are exactly like the beautiful blue amethyst of Galveston, which you then pluck out and put on a nice ring to give to your beloved. It's simply saying, look, it has the characteristics of being soft and being that pure, pure blue. But arguments by analogy are much more interesting. So what you're saying when you have an argument by analogy is that you have at least two items, item A and item B, and you're saying, look, item A and item B share some characteristics in common, and if you believe my argument works, item A has a feature that you should also think that item B has as well. So they share enough characteristics that it should follow that if one has a further characteristic, the other should have a further characteristic. So that's the whole point of the 1948 show sketch. If you believe that every Sydney Lotterbed has the same feature, wearing the same hat, the same shirt, speaking with the same voice, having the same interests and such like, and then it's reasonable to assume that if one has a wife, the others should have a wife too. The comedic output is, wouldn't it be hilarious if it weren't they each have an identical wife, it turns out they all have exactly the same wife. That's the comedy that comes out of that particular analogy. And you get lots of nice examples of arguments by analogy in the political literature. And here's one which gets used all the time. The government is rightly committed to providing satisfactory defence for all citizens. In just the same way, it should be committed to ensuring satisfactory healthcare, housing and education for all citizens. Good argument or bad? Well, let's look at the first claim. The government is rightly committed to providing satisfactory defence for all citizens. If we assume that's true, and we'll actually argue about whether it's actually true in just a minute, if we assume that's true, can we by extension say, look, if the government is rightly committed to providing satisfactory defence for all citizens, does it follow that the government should be committed to ensuring satisfactory healthcare, housing and education for all citizens? Are they similar things or are they different things?
They're not related to each other anyway.
All right, so
Education, I'm not saying.
I would agree with you.
So you'd agree with the, yeah?
Oh, yeah, like, in terms of definition, in terms of the basis for a civilization, I'd say they're foundational elements.
All right, so foundational elements.
Yeah,
So-
shelter, health, protection, and then furthering oneself through education.
All right, so you're agreeing with the argument here that
No,
they,
not necessarily.
not necessarily?
Is the defence internal or external? Should we protect it
Can be
from
both.
people coming to invading our country?
All right, so
should
let's-
the government protect us from burglars and that, or do we
Exactly.
buy our own burglar alarms?
All right, so let's assume by statutory defence for all citizens we're referring to internal policing, but also having, say, a militarised force to protect us from external
So both
threats.
internal and external.
Yeah, so it says here a general defence. So you are to be defended by people who come to this country and also to be defended by people within the country. Actually, interesting enough, a friend of mine recently renounced her American citizenship and became a New Zealand citizen. And as part of the swearing in of becoming a New Zealand citizen, you swear allegiance to the Queen and protection of the realm. And it occurred to me when this was going on, I have never been asked to swear any protection to the realm whatsoever. So as far as I can tell, my friend who's become a citizen is obliged by an oath she made to protect the realm in case of danger. I, on other hand, am not. I've never made that particular claim at all. So my friend Kira must protect me in case of evasion. And I'll be relying upon her solely at that time. I don't know whether she'll be particularly good, but it is her obligation to look after me. If you have foreign friends who have become citizens, ensure you know where they are in case of invasion, because they are legally required to protect you. And any of you who are considering becoming permanent residents or citizens here, be aware that I will be taking your names down and coming to you in a time of crisis.
I suppose it gets back to the definition of satisfactory as well.
All right.
Yes.
What's satisfactory to one person might not be satisfactory for another person. And to that extent, if certain healthcare and housing and education isn't satisfactory for what you expect, you can pay to get a better quality. So it would be the definition of what is satisfactory.
All right, so there's a nice crucial ambiguity here, which is actually satisfactory is one of those things that sounds really good in political speech, but actually it turns out what is satisfactory healthcare. So you might say, look,
It's subjective.
yeah. So satisfactory healthcare might be, look, if you're dying, we'll provide you with services to make sure that your death is pleasant. That's satisfactory healthcare. Give you good palliative care. Everything else, you're on your own. For other people, say no. Satisfactory healthcare is if I get sick, you pay for my doctor's visits. If I have to go to a specialist, you pay for those. That's satisfactory healthcare. And housing could be the same thing as well. Everyone gets a one-bedroom micro unit, which you have by right, but that's all you get. Other people say, well, no, every New Zealander deserves their half-hectare of land, which they can do with as they will. But let's ignore that ambiguity here. Is it the case that the government is rightly committed to providing satisfactory defence for all citizens? Is that something the government should provide for its citizenry? I mean, is that something we would be happy to leave up to private provision, policing and military force? Or is that the kind of thing which we think that's the reason why we have government, is to provide for that particular thing?
That's one reason why we pay taxes.
Our government don't do that. They're helpless.
Oh, so, well,
They can't go and support the
But then it's the
Australians.
satisfactory bit.
Yeah, so it is. I mean, we do have a police force,
Yes, we don't.
and we do have a navy which is actually pretty good at least patrolling our waters. You might, and we only arguing defence forces, so we're not talking about doing things overseas. I mean, but there was a big question: could we defend ourselves against Australia?
We're not a defence force.
So
We've got a
arguably it's
peacekeeping
been
force.
successful because we've never been invaded.
That's
Yeah.
correct.
And thus it is very satisfactory at this stage.
Exactly. That's the key.
So most people are happy to go, look, governments are the kind of things that should provide us with defence. Because actually, most people are concerned about private provision of defence. In fact, historically, the private provision of policing in places like London basically meant you had a criminalised police force. It said, well, I'll look after you as long as you pay me the right money. It's going up this week, and otherwise you might find yourself being robbed by me. But I'll protect you from me if you pay me the right amount of coin. Which is why they tended to nationalise police forces and bring them under the aegis of central government. Is it the case that in the same way that we think that governments should actually provide satisfactory defence, we think they should provide healthcare, housing and education for all? Or is that the kind of thing where defence is more important, or satisfactory healthcare, housing and education is more important? So you'd actually go the reverse. Provide those and then possibly satisfactory defence.
Depends what you like.
I was going to say, I don't think it's relevant because it depends where you live. If you're in Saudi Arabia, for instance, education for women is not very important, and I don't know what their housing policy is and their healthcare policy wouldn't have a clue. But they're pretty good on defence because apparently they're busy attacking other Arab countries. So, they've got a good defence force. It doesn't mean that they're satisfactorily educating people in their country. I think they're mutually exclusive.
Okay, so we've got an argument here for no. There's
Depends
no.
which
There's
country.
no
If
analogy.
you said for
Yeah.
New Zealand, then possibly yes, but you haven't said which country it is. So,
Right, so
you
you're
know, there's the
saying.
same standards throughout the world. India would have a very different thing as well. They worry about Pakistan and maybe not so much about education and housing because there are lots of poor people there.
Right. So there's a kind of hidden assumption here. There needs to be an argument that links it, which gives you a rationale. Okay. Yeah. Anyone else got anything else they want to add to that?
Just to can you clarify what you mean? So, are you saying that because
I don't think that defence and healthcare and housing and education are linked because they are mutually exclusive. Not everybody wants the same things. If you lived in an Arab country, defence may be more important to you.
But that's what it's saying,
New
though, right?
Zealand.
Maybe if we put New Zealand government.
Yeah,
But that's what it's saying, though, right? So it's saying that the government is rightly committed to provide defence.
Yes,
Look
and
the same way
it's
that
no
it-
satisfactory and satisfactory healthcare. And I'm saying, well, it doesn't mean because you do defence that you should
But the
do
next
healthcare
bit's
or
saying that
housing.
in the same way it should be committed. So it's not saying it actually
It's
is.
not necessarily.
All right. So the difference of opinion here is that it's a difference in going, look, it's not analogous, the provision of healthcare, education, and housing to the provision of defence. But of course, and this is the whole point, people disagree about arguments of this type because they don't agree that there's an analogy between the former claim and the latter claim. And that's where arguments by analogy fall down. Because some people will say, look, the analogy is really strong and provide reasons why. And some people say, no, the analogy is weak and provide reasons why. And so what you're doing when you're doing that is you're breaking the analogy apart and debating the individual merit of the actual analogy. And what's interesting about this is where it all falls down for arguments by analogy, because people get worried about whether the analogy is strong or weak, and so they debate the minutiae of that particular type. What's interesting about this example is that actually there are simpler ways to put it without having to rely upon an analogy. And when you change the argument by analogy into a simply deductive argument that doesn't proceed by analogy, it becomes clear where people's disagreements are actually occurring. And any argument by analogy of this particular type can be made into a non-analogous argument that makes clear that there are two claims at root here, which some people will agree with and some people will disagree with.
So I agree with. I'm sorry, I can't remember your name now.
My name,
Yeah.
Arlene.
I agree with what Arlene's saying. If we go back for a second, that statement can't work for New Zealand, then, right?
I didn't say that. I said
No,
I think it
I'm
depends where
not
you
saying.
live.
No, I'm not talking about what you're saying. What I'm saying is that this statement can only apply to places like a place where they heavily look at defence and they've got really shit housing, education.
Well, no. I mean, it could apply here. I mean, we've got.
Four of the critical issues of the election.
Yeah, I mean, and we have.
I'm just
I just
reading.
the Americans in Iraq.
I'm just reading the should be bit, right? So that to me is important. That it's an idealistic view, in the same way that it should be committed to ensuring. Right, whereas
It's easy to hear, you know,
There's
they're
an
always saying they
implication
have
that
money
it
to
should
help.
be, but the others three are not.
I mean, for example,
Yeah.
ACT has campaigned in the last term quite heavily that education really should be a privately delivered good and government should not be involved in it. So they're going, well, look, ACT is quite big on law and order and defence of the realm. They think that actually the government it's one of the things the government should do, provide protection for citizenry. But ACT is also of the opinion that our welfare state should be dismantled because healthcare, housing, and education can be more effectively provided by the private realm. So they're disputing the analogy there, and they'll try to advance an argument for it. So they're rejecting the premise that says, in the same way, the government should be committed. They're breaking it apart. They're saying the analogy just doesn't hold, and they try to argue as to here's why. And that's why, as I said, this is why the analogy breaks down here, because it's much harder to work out what's going on when it's an analogy, as opposed to what it would look like if we simply broke it down into its deductive form. So let me just show you what it would actually look like. So you have one claim: if something is an essential social service, then it is right for governments to be committed to providing it for all citizens. That's an implied premise within the claim. And so the claim goes, look, satisfactory healthcare, housing, education is an essential social service. Therefore, it is right for the government to be committed to providing satisfactory healthcare, housing, and education for all citizens. And where people disagree in this particular argument is either with the first claim, essential social services are things the government should provide. So in some countries, these services are provided by private entities. So to a certain extent, some of those provisions in America are provided by corporations rather than local governments. In the UK, they're trying private partnerships out to a very large extent. So for example, the parole system in the UK is now run by a private firm. It's no longer run by the public system at all. So they're going, look, the prison system, we can privatize that. Government doesn't need to be involved in the incarceration or rehabilitation of prisoners. Arguably, they might try to do the same thing with the NHS long term.
You're getting that.
Yeah,
You're getting that.
they are. And in New Zealand, we still have very large elements of the social welfare state, but we've privatised some bits of it, and we're talking about privatising other bits of it as well. And of course, some people will dispute premise two. They'll go, look, is it the case that healthcare, housing, and education is an essential social service? And they'll dispute it by saying, look, either they're not essential social services at all, or they'll go, look, I think some of them are essential social services, but not all of them. And that's a conjunction. You have to believe all three are true at the same time. So some people want to say, look, I think healthcare is an essential social service because it's just too difficult for individuals to actually have their own healthcare system. Imagine being an individual who has to not only treat their own cancer, but also research cures for cancer. That's ridiculous. You need a healthcare system to engage in that level of investigation and funding. Individuals can't do that. But anyone can build a house. I mean, frankly, as long as people have access to land, they can knock up a house in no time. You don't need the government involved in the regulation of building houses. They can build houses to the heart's content, those individuals. That's what the settlers did, and that made them the great people they are today, even though they're all dead. Education. You don't need a school system. People can read books. I mean, it's a big question how they learn to read without an education system, but surely there are books that teach reading, so it'll be fine. So some people might say, look, I think healthcare is an essential social service, but housing and education aren't. Or some people say, look, education is an essential social service, but healthcare and housing aren't, or any combination of the two. And so people are debating essentially premise one and premise two. One or the other or both, and going, look, the conclusion just doesn't follow because either I don't believe in the principle, the claim that if something is an essential social service, the government should provide it, or they don't believe in the actual linking claim that says, look, if that's true, then that must be true as well. And that's where all the debate about analogies tends to fall down. Actually, it turns out when you're explicit about what the analogy is doing, there are 2 points of attack. The principle that links the things, or the things you are trying to link. You can agree with the principle, but disagree with the actual solid claim here by saying, look, these aren't essential social services. Or you say they are essential social services, I just don't believe the government is required to provide them. Anyone can provide them if organised in just the right way. Yes?
If you're also saying it should provide it to all citizens.
Yes.
And that's not necessarily the case. I mean, so you might need a safety net.
All right, so you might...
Citizens can provide for themselves, and in terms of social welfare, you want to have a safety net to protect people from...
Oh, and once again, that's an argument about the principle again. You might go, look, I disagree with...
Citizens need housing. Some can provide for themselves, and some might need it.
Well, although actually in that particular case, so there are 2 points to be made there. The first point is you're disagreeing with the principle there. You might say, look, I disagree with this particular principle. I would agree with a principle that says if something is an essential social service, there's right for the government to be committed to providing it to citizens that require it, which would be a different principle. Your second point is that you're going, well, actually, and also, I don't think that housing is an essential social service. So you're saying, I don't think that belongs in the group of things which are essential social services.
I don't think the government should provide it for all citizens. For some citizens, they might need to provide it, but not for all citizens.
All right. So that's once to get you back to the disagreeing with the principle.
Yeah.
So if you narrow the principle to only apply to the group you're interested in, then you might say the argument works. And so the new analogy in that case would be
Well,
something
I
like.
say all citizens have access to, but it's not the government's obligation to provide it.
Okay, actually, so that would be a quite different principle then. So all citizens should have access to essential social services. Satisfactory healthcare, housing, education is essential social service. Therefore, all citizens should have access to essential social services. That's agnostic in that case as to who would be providing those essential social services. As long as they're provided by someone, it doesn't need to be the government. It could be your local anarchist collective, for example, or your local communist local government. And you have to remember, there are lots of nations on Earth which have a central government that basically only takes care of regulatory issues and allow local governments to do the actual provision of services. So Italy, to a large extent, local government has most of the power when it comes to looking after citizens, and they do it in different ways. The central government deals with the regulatory issues of international trade and just making sure taxes go into the right location. Although maybe Italy's not the best example of working out where taxes go.
Even law and order, they're not too good at.
But it actually, chunks of Europe are special cases at the moment, and it just shows you that democracies can be wonderfully multivariate in their application, and sometimes it's quite lucky to be in a system where we've got a nice centralized system that, by and large, does tend to work.
Singapore, that's the best place.
Cuba does that quite
Well, so Singapore is actually quite fascinating in this
So
respect.
do you all 3 ways then?
Because Singapore, there's virtually no private ownership of housing at all. The state basically provides all housing for citizens, and yet libertarians, by and large, put it forward as being a libertarian paradise, despite the fact that actually owning property in Singapore is very difficult and actually largely frowned upon. They've got a massive social welfare state, but they also have low taxes. It's a really quite fascinating. And while Cuba, on the other hand, has a huge social welfare state where no one gets paid particularly well for their job, the plus side being that no one gets paid particularly well for their job, so there's no wealth disparity in Cuba. You can be a janitor or a plastic surgeon, you get the same wage. And yet they still have plastic surgeons.
And cars from the 1950s.
Yeah, although actually, they've now got cars from the 1970s. They had a recent import, because the ones from the 1950s are not as reliable as they were before.
I was going to say, all the Americans will be buying those cars back and refurbishing.
Yeah, and strangely enough,
Market.
and strangely enough, Americans go to Cuba for their private healthcare provision, because Cuban healthcare is better than American healthcare on average.
Doctors are actually quite good though. A lot of Cuban doctors work in South Africa, where I come from, and they're actually very good
Yeah, no,
doctors.
they are very well trained.
And they're very good.
Yeah, they're very well trained, and they don't do it for the money, because you can get as much money being a janitor. They do it because it's a vocational choice. There's much to be said for Cuba. There's also much to be said against Cuba. Don't let it be said that I'm an apologist for Cuba. Their human rights record is not good, but then again, neither is America's. It swings and roundabouts. So if we want to evaluate an argument by analogy, there are a number of things we need to keep in mind. So when we're comparing an argument by analogy, we need to compare the number of items which are being compared between one group and another group. So the more items in a group, the better. The fewer items in a group, the worse. So for example, if I say, look, I'm male, you're male, I've got a tattoo of a sea fish on my bottom, therefore you must do too, that's a pretty bad analogy. There's not many members in the group, and there's not much reason to believe that just because you're male, you've got a tattoo of the same type that I've got a tattoo. I thought, I'm male, you're male, my name is Matthew, your name is Matthew, you're a clone of me, therefore you'll have a tattoo. Then that's a much stronger analogy, saying, look, there are lots of features between this item called Matthew and that item called Matthew that we can predict that if Matthew has one further feature, the tattoo, it must be the case that the clone of Matthew has that further feature as well. Although when I think about it, clones aren't going to inherit tattoos, so that would also have to indicate the clone got the tattoo. It's another matter entirely. And of course, variety actually ends up being particularly good for any analogy you make, because you actually want there to be lots of different things in your group which share common features nonetheless. You run an analogy only about males in New Zealand, then your analogy is not going to be particularly good when it's applied to a female member of society. Well, so if your analogy is saying, look, both men and women with the following features also have this particular feature, then if you find a random woman within your society, you go, look, if they've got these features, then the other features likely to follow as well. And of course, you want the similarities to basically be relevant. So you want to be able to say, look, you've got two things here, and the similarities here are salient to the kind of conclusion I'm trying to put forward. When I want to say that, look, healthcare is a desiderata which all governments should engage in, I want to say that's because, given what we also agree government should do, which is providing housing, providing education, providing mermaids for people who live along the seashore, and ensuring that attacks upon the moon are engaged with vigour, you might go, well, hold on, those last two things don't seem like the kind of thing which is relevant to your argument here. I mean, I was with you with the housing and the healthcare, but suddenly we have to provide mermaids for people and we need to attack the moon? It doesn't seem like a kind of relevant thing to your conclusion in this particular case. So you need to make sure that when you make the analogy, what you're talking about are relevant similarities, rather than things that actually end up being completely dissimilar. And in the same respect, you want to reduce the relevant dissimilarities. You want to make sure that if there are any dissimilarities, they're explained away or they're kept minimized to a very large extent. And of course, modesty of the conclusion. If you say, if you believe A, then you really must believe B as well, then your analogy is going to fall down if people find exceptions to it. If you say, well, look, you probably should believe B, then people are going to go, well, there are some dissimilarities here, but he's not saying you've got to believe it. He's simply saying that you should believe it, i.e. there are good grounds for considering this position. So sometimes being modest in our conclusions is a way of making our argument stronger. This isn't to say we should have vague conclusions. It's simply saying that in a situation where you're comparing things and saying if this set of things has the following features and this set of things has the same features, and it turns out this thing here has a further feature, the provision of satisfactory housing, healthcare and education for all citizens, then probably this thing over here should have that same feature as well.
Starting with the stronger and then just getting on a slight at the end.
So can you expand upon that?
Well, when you talk about the first analogy,
Yeah.
as being the A, that should be the stronger of the.
Oh, all right. So work with your strongest similarity.
Yes, and as such, the secondary, which is slightly softer, well then they
Yeah. So actually, so we go back to that first example. This one here. If you go, well, look, the strong claim here that everyone agrees with is that the government is rightly committed to providing satisfactory defence for all citizens, and no one wants to disagree with that. There will be some libertarians who disagree with that, but by and large, most people think that's the role of good government. And then you go, and so by extension, if you believe this, by analogy, you should believe this particular claim as well. But I'm not saying you have to believe it. I'm simply saying you should give it due consideration here. So you have a modest conclusion that says, no, it's not the case, it must be. You have a immodest conclusion that goes, look, it's probably the case, you should believe this as well. Which means it's more likely that people are going to consider it seriously. You say, no, it must be the case. People will go, well, no, I just don't agree with the analogy there at all. You say, well, you should consider it. People will then go, yeah, all right, so I disagree with some of the analogy here, but I can kind of see what you're getting at. And thus you engage in the argument much more. And often this is put forward in politics as being the politics of compromise. You don't want to make big, bold claims, because big, bold claims are the kind of things that can be rejected by the other side almost immediately. You say, well, consider this. The other side might go, all right, I don't buy all of it, but I buy enough of it that I'm fairly sure that when it goes to the second reading, we can modify the bill and make it much closer to my particular intention. And so you get that delightful compromise that goes on in those kind of situations. But of course, sometimes analogies are bad for the sheer fact that actually they either have a bad principle, so the reason for joining two things together actually ends up being faulty, or the actual analogy is bad, the two situations which are being considered basically don't have enough similarities for them to be worthwhile. And so when we look at, say, this example in now much more explicit form, so we have a claim that defence is an essential social service, the claim it is right for the government to be committed to ensuring satisfactory defence for all citizens, an expansion of that principle. The reason why it is right for the government to be committed to ensuring satisfactory defence for all citizens is that the following principle is true. If something is an essential social service, then it is right for the government to be committed to providing it for all citizens. It's making explicit what the principle is there. And then the analogy, just like satisfactory defence, the provision of satisfactory healthcare, housing and education falls under this principle. Therefore, satisfactory healthcare, housing and education is an essential social service. And satisfactory health, blah, 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 it is right for the government to be committed to. And if you're going to call into question what's wrong with the argument, either you attack the principle or you attack the analogy by saying that one of them is faulty. And almost every argument by analogy can be rendered into this complex form. And this is largely why we argue by an analogy, because actually the complex form is actually quite difficult to go through. So you go, well, it's like this. And that's often why the arguments don't work, because when you say it's like this, you then have to, for you to debate it, you've got to break it into its constituent parts, and people get hung up on the analogy. Are these things similar? Rather than actually focusing upon the principle, which is what unites them if you were to believe that particular claim of similarity. And of course, lots of analogies are faulty for a variety of different reasons. Here's this one's trite. Minds like rivers can be broad. The broader the river, the shallower it is. Therefore, the broader the mind, the shallower it is. What's wrong with that analogy?
It's an assumption for river shallow.
Yeah. Lots of broad rivers are very, very deep. Take the Waikato, for example. There are parts of the Waikato which are very, 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 very broad indeed, and you wouldn't want to go swimming in them because your feet are never going to touch the ground. So it's just a faulty analogy here. Just because a river is broad tells you nothing about the shallowness of that particular waterway. And also, just because your mind is broad, that doesn't mean that you have a shallow understanding of lots of things. You have a very broad set of interests and be very well educated on all of them. And if you're not well educated on all of them, you've always got Wikipedia to keep yourself informed about these things. And of course, sometimes people react to analogies by being zealous and treating them overly literally. So, for example, I'm sick of people saying that retirement's like a long holiday. It's not. A long holiday is a gap between periods of work, and usually one gets paid for at least some of a holiday. Retirement's not like that at all. Why is that an inappropriate response to someone saying retirement's like a long holiday? Are we meant to take the analogy literally when someone says, look, retirement's like a long holiday? No, it's a kind of illustration, isn't it? You're not saying it's literally like a long holiday. You're saying, look, when you're retired, you can sleep in every day. You don't have to worry anymore about going into work. You're not saying it's literally like being on a long holiday where retirement means going to Venice and Greece, spending time in Ibiza, going to nightclubs, taking E and all those things. I mean, no, look, It's just there are certain relaxing features to being retired, which are very similar to that of being on holiday. It's an overly zealous response by treating an analogy literally, when it's only meant to be illustrative. And lots of people do this all the time. For example, the universe is like a complex machine with parts fine-tuned for specific purposes. But as we know, any complex machine has a design, so somebody must have designed the universe. Why is this a not particularly good analogy?
Sort of circular.
All right, so it's sort of circular.
Being a machine, and then something it has to be designed, but it doesn't mean that somebody designed the universe because machines are complicated. They're not.
Making the assumption that if it's a design is created by
A designer, yeah.
Yeah, a person.
So the analogy presumably is the universe is like a complex machine. Does that mean the universe is a complex machine? No, you're simply saying, look, it's got elements of a complex machine. The universe looks like it runs on clockwork, but that's not saying the universe is literally a clock. It's simply saying that, by analogy, in the same way that clocks run using rules and laws, the universe also appears to run using rules and laws. But that's not saying that just because a clock has a designer, we have to assume the universe has a designer as well. The analogy doesn't entail that. It simply says it's similar to, and thus we can make some assumptions about it, i.e. it works in a regular fashion. But that doesn't entail it has the further feature that because its clocks have designers, the universe must have a designer as well. The analogy is merely illustrative, and yet often people will say, well, no, hold on. If you say the universe is like a machine, well, we know machines have designers, so you must be committed to believing the universe is a designer as well. Now, this doesn't mean the universe doesn't have a designer. It's simply saying this is a bad argument towards that particular claim. And you get all sorts of examples like that in the debating chamber. I remember ages ago when they were having the debate about the Section 59 repeal, so the so-called anti-smacking law. And people were going, look, all these conservative MPs and Christian MPs who keep on using the Bible as an example of how we should rear children. You wouldn't use an iPad manual. Actually, no, iPad manual is completely out of date for that. You wouldn't use a manual for your MacBook as a... oh, actually, no, hold on. I've got this completely wrong now. I'm sorry. It's got completely distracted by my own thought images. You wouldn't use an operating manual for a C64 to operate your MacBook, would you? That's where I was trying to get to. I was getting the iPad and MacBook thing confused and forgetting actually the first step of it was to actually use an outdated computational device. In the same respect, you wouldn't use the Bible as your handbook for rearing a child. So once again, looking at the analogy in a kind of perverse fashion. Yes, it is the case that you wouldn't use a Commodore 64 manual to try and operate your MacBook. That would be frankly ridiculous. And so by extension, you wouldn't use the Bible as a child-rearing manual either. It's extending that analogy. And then the question is that an appropriate analogy to make? And the argument goes both ways. Would you actually argue that the Bible is appropriate? In the same respect, would you also argue that comparing the Bible with a computer manual is the right way to debunk that particular type of claim? And, you know, things do get quite confusing there. We'll just end very quickly on a lovely story which is slightly racist. Have I told you the One True Scotsman story before?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is the straw man fallacy, which basically operates on the One True Scotsman argument. You present an argument for a particular position X. Someone presents a mischaracterization of that position, and you defeat that mischaracterization of the position, and then you drop the mic and walk away, going, look, I've defeated that person in unarmed combat, believe nothing they say. And of course, actually, it turns out that actually you haven't attacked what they said, you've attacked a misconstrual of what they've said. And the straw man fallacy is popular in political circles for the sheer fact that it's much easier to debate an opponent with a made-up argument than it is to defeat an opponent and actually what they said. So you often find in the prime ministerial debates we had just a few weeks ago that John Key and David Shearer often weren't responding to what the other person said, but rather what they hoped they said, defeating what they hoped they said, and hoping that the moderator or the audience weren't actually paying attention to what they actually said. And this is the kind of standard of political debate we have in this country and actually worldwide when it comes to political debate. It's much easier to debate a straw man version of an opponent's policies than it would be to actually attack what that person has actually said in the chamber, in the House, or on TV. And so you end up having lots of examples of the straw man fallacy. You either claim that their position has extreme practical implications it might not have. You make someone's position really quite simplistic and thus actually not what they actually said. So this example goes, Ms. Eastman thinks we should investigate a dig on North Head to find those missing tunnels. We don't really want bulldozers digging up the hillside, do we? Which is an emotive way to say, look, don't disturb the environment, but kind of ignores the fact that archaeological investigations are performed by very small brushes and trowels and not by bulldozers at all. Taking people's arguments out of context is another popular way to commit the straw man fallacy by going, look, we could investigate North Head, but how would that feed the starving children? And the people who investigate, no, we don't. We're investigating it because we think a large crime is being committed. And yes, it's true we have to spend money to uncover that crime, but surely discovering that crime is actually quite important. That doesn't mean we don't care about starving children. That's really not what we were trying to say at all. Or finding examples of people who hold completely and utterly wacky or implausible views. Although actually this example is slightly true. There are conspiracy theorists about the North Head Tunnel complex who are of the opinion that the real reason why North Head is kept off limits to us mere mortals is it is in fact a UFO refueling station. Yeah, and it's based upon the work of Bruce Cathie, who was a Royal New Zealand Air Force pilot who wrote a book called Harmonic 242, in which he was able to predict and plot all UFO sightings all over the Earth, generate a mathematical map of where UFO sightings occur on a grid, and people discovered that North Head was a node on that grid. Ipso facto, it must be where UFOs lurk. Why is there a government conspiracy? It's because it's a UFO refueling station. Case closed, I feel. It's quite obvious that actually that's precisely what the real conspiracy is. I lived in Devonport for 25 years and I never saw a UFO over North Head. And that just shows you how deep the conspiracy goes, that even the residents of Devonport don't see the UFOs, which means either I'm in on the conspiracy or the fluoride in our water supply is doing a really good job of making me very docile indeed. So remember, don't drink the water. No, anywhere. There's fluoride in all the water. Don't drink any water. Between now and next week, drink no water. You'll find your critical thinking faculties change quite substantially after a week with no water. I'm not saying they'll get better. I'm just saying they'll change. And also you'll be dead. So please do drink some water between now and next week. Otherwise, it's going to be very awkward when they ask, so why did all your students die? I told them not to drink water, and they quite obviously didn't pay any attention to anything I said about appeals to authority, because I'm not the right kind of person to listen to. You need to listen to your nutritionist or your GP about the right water intake for you. I may be a doctor, I'm not that kind of doctor. And I'm going to leave you with that adage, to go off and drink water to your heart's content, but not too much, because that will also kill you. It will strip the salts from your blood supply and then you'll die as well. Drink the right amount of water. Drink a satisfactory amount of water between now and next week, and then report back to me as to what a satisfactory amount of water actually